finally, Jack Nicholson. He turned 89 this week. Nicholson, a three-time Oscar winner, doesn't make many public appearances these days.
And man, he might be the best of all time.
Yeah.
3 Oscars, 12 nominations. The most dangerous smile in the history of American cinema. For 4 decades, Jack Nicholson owned every room he walked into, every scene he appeared in, every conversation about who the greatest living actor was. Then, after 2010, he simply vanished. No farewell film, no retirement.
There is a house on Mulholland Drive in Los Angeles where one of the greatest actors who ever lived has spent the last 15 years in almost complete silence. No films, no interviews, no red carpets, no explanations. Just a gate, a driveway, and the kind of quiet that feels louder than anything he ever said on screen. Most celebrities who disappear from public life eventually resurface, a comeback project, a memoir, a talk show appearance to remind the world they still exist. Jack Nicholson did none of that. He simply stopped, and the world has been trying to understand why ever since. What makes his disappearance so remarkable is the scale of what he walked away from. This was not a fading actor who had run out of offers. This was the man with 3 Academy Awards. The man whose name alone could greenlight a film. The man who sat courtside at Lakers games in his signature sunglasses and became as famous for being himself as for anything he ever played. When someone like that vanishes without a word, people notice. And when 15 years pass without a single film, without a single interview, without anything beyond the occasional blurry photograph taken outside a restaurant, the questions only grow louder. This is the story of how Jack Nicholson became the most celebrated actor of his generation, what his life looked like behind the scenes during the years the cameras were still rolling, and what actually happened to pull one of Hollywood's most magnetic personalities permanently behind closed doors. Jack Nicholson was born on April 22, 1937, and almost from the beginning, his life was built on a foundation of secrets. He grew up in Neptune, New Jersey, in a modest household, raised by a woman he believed was his mother and a man he believed was his father. The truth was something else entirely. His biological mother was a young woman named June, who had become pregnant out of wedlock at a time when that carried enormous social consequences. To protect the family's reputation, June's own mother stepped in and registered the child as hers. June was presented to young Jack as his older sister. Nobody corrected the record. Nobody explained the arrangement. The fiction became the reality, and Jack grew up inside it without ever knowing. He would not discover the truth until 1974, when he was already 37 years old and one of the most recognized faces in American cinema. A journalist working on a magazine profile uncovered the details and informed him directly. The 2 women who could have explained the full story, his grandmother, who had raised him as her son, and his biological mother, June, had both already died. One had passed in 1963, the other in 1970. Jack learned the truth about who he was from a reporter, not from family, and the people he most needed to speak with were no longer alive to answer his questions. He handled the revelation with a composure that surprised people around him. He spoke about it publicly on a few occasions and described it as dramatic rather than traumatic, largely because by the time he found out, he was already a fully formed adult with a career and an identity of his own. But the effects of growing up inside that particular kind of silence were real, even if they were subtle. He became someone who kept his emotional life compartmentalized, who preferred to control what the world knew about him, who built a public persona, so vivid and theatrical that it functioned almost as protective armor. The wild grin, the sunglasses, the outsized personality, all of it created a version of Jack Nicholson that people could engage with while the real one stayed out of reach. His path into acting was not a straight line. He arrived in Hollywood as a teenager with no connections and no particular plan, and spent his early years doing whatever work he could find. His first job in the entertainment industry was not in front of a camera at all. He worked as an errand runner at an animation studio, carrying messages and making himself useful in whatever capacity was needed. It was a long way from stardom, and for a while it looked like he might stay there. He eventually found his way into acting classes and began the slow, grinding work of building a career from nothing. Through the late 1950s and most of the 1960s, he appeared in a series of low-budget films that almost nobody saw, writing screenplays on the side because the acting work alone was not enough to sustain him. He was in his early 30s and still essentially unknown when a last-minute piece of luck changed everything. A role in the 1969 counterculture film Easy Rider came to him because another actor departed from the production unexpectedly. The part was supporting rather than central, but the performance was so alive, so genuinely funny and humane and surprising, that audiences and critics couldn't look away from him. He received his first Academy Award nomination, and suddenly the industry understood what it had been overlooking for a decade. What followed was one of the most sustained runs of great work in the history of American film. He delivered performance after performance that demonstrated a range most actors never approach. He could play despair with complete authenticity and then turn around and fill a scene with more energy than seemed physically possible. He played characters who were losing their minds, characters navigating devastating grief, characters operating in moral gray areas with unsettling charm. He won his first Oscar for One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest in 1975, his second for Terms of Endearment in 1983, and his third for As Good as It Gets in 1997. 3 awards across more than 2 decades, each one for a completely different kind of performance. That kind of consistency is essentially unprecedented. His commercial instincts were as sharp as his artistic ones. When he negotiated his deal for Batman in 1989, he structured it to include a share of the film's profits rather than simply taking a flat fee. The movie became one of the biggest box office events of its era, and by various accounts his total earnings from that single film ran into the range of $60 to $90 million. He understood the business as well as the craft, which made his eventual departure from both all the more striking. Behind the professional achievements, his personal life followed patterns that would eventually take their toll. His most significant long-term relationship was with actress Angelica Huston, which lasted roughly 17 years. By any measure, it was a serious relationship, one that both parties invested in deeply, and that shaped both of their lives during some of their most important professional years. But Nicholson ended it in a way that caused significant pain. He told her over dinner that another woman was pregnant with his child. That conversation effectively ended everything between them in a single evening, after nearly 2 decades. The woman he had been involved with separately, Rebecca Broussard, became the mother of 2 of his children, a daughter named Lorraine born in 1990 and a son named Ray born in 1992. But that relationship also eventually dissolved. There were other relationships in the years that followed, but by the time he reached his late 60s, he had spoken openly in interviews about feeling a fundamental shift in his energy and appetite for the kind of life he had been living. In one of his last extended press interviews, given to Vanity Fair in 2013, he said something that was more revealing than anything else in the piece. He talked about no longer having the drive to be out in the world. He said that toward the end of his film career, he had barely been leaving his hotel room at night during productions. For a man who had been famous for decades for living more extravagantly and fully than almost anyone else in his industry, that admission pointed towards something significant happening beneath the surface. His final film was a romantic comedy called How Do You Know, released in December of 2010. The film did not connect with audiences and lost a substantial amount of money at the box office. And then, without any announcement, without any public statement, without even an indirect acknowledgement, Jack Nicholson simply did not make another movie. 1 year passed. Then 2. Then 5. The industry kept moving forward and he stayed behind. The first wave of public speculation focused on his health. Reports circulated in 2013 suggesting that memory difficulties had made it impossible for him to learn lines. People close to him pushed back against those reports at the time, with sources indicating that he was still reading scripts and remaining engaged with the idea of working. That account was supported years later when director James L. Brooks mentioned that Nicholson had been attached to an American remake of a German film in 2017, a project that briefly looked like a genuine return before ultimately falling apart. The detail that stayed with people was that Nicholson had still been reading scripts all along, that the door in his mind had never quite closed, even as no project ever crossed the threshold from consideration to production. Reports from people with access to his world in the years that followed described a life that had contracted significantly. He spent the overwhelming majority of his time at his home. His children, particularly Lorraine and Ray, became central figures in his daily life, serving as companions and, as time went on, as caretakers. Ray Nicholson has spoken about his father with genuine warmth in various interviews, describing a man who was present and engaged during his childhood and from whom he learned his understanding of what it meant to be a person in the world. That portrait of a father who was there, who showed up for dinners, who was actually present in his children's lives in ways that his public persona might not have suggested, adds a dimension to the story of his withdrawal that goes beyond simple isolation. In February 2025, something unexpected happened. NBC broadcast a special celebrating the 50th anniversary of Saturday Night Live, and Jack Nicholson was there. He was sitting in the audience rather than standing on stage, wearing a dark jacket and a beret. And when the moment came, he leaned forward and said 5 words into a microphone. He introduced Adam Sandler, his co-star from the 2003 film Anger Management, and the room responded with the kind of reaction that told you everything about how long he had been absent and how much his presence still meant. Sandler's response from the stage was immediate and emotional. He pointed toward where Nicholson was sitting and told the audience to acknowledge him, saying he loved him and was grateful he had come out. For Nicholson, who had not been photographed at a public event since a Lakers game in 2023, the appearance carried enormous weight. He was 87 years old. Photographers caught him the following day leaving a New York hotel, walking with a cane. People who saw the images had different reactions. Some focused on how well he appeared to be doing for his age. Others noted the visible change from the man they remembered. But what struck observers most was the nature of the appearance itself. He had not come back to announce a project. He had not given an interview. He had not attempted to recapture anything. He had simply shown up, said 5 words, and then gone back to his life. It felt less like a public appearance, and more like a deliberate, quiet farewell, an acknowledgement from inside the crowd that he had been part of something, and that it mattered to him even now. Those who have spoken publicly about Nicholson in recent years have consistently offered a picture of someone who is not suffering from a dramatic crisis, but who has made a genuine choice about how he wants to live. Danny DeVito, who has been one of his closest friends for more than 50 years, spoke to a publication in mid-2025 and described having seen Nicholson recently and finding him to be doing well. That kind of account, from someone with real access and real history with the man, carries more weight than the speculation that has filled in the gaps during years of public silence. A source who spoke to a publication in 2025 offered perhaps the most direct explanation that has ever been put into words publicly. The source said that Nicholson and the people around him preferred that the world remember him the way he was. That is not a statement about decline or crisis. That is a statement about identity and legacy, and the very specific kind of self-awareness that comes from having lived at the absolute center of public attention for 4 decades and understanding precisely what that attention does to a person's image over time. He had seen what happened to careers that extended past their natural end. He had watched reputations get complicated by work that wasn't up to the standard of what came before. He understood the mathematics of legacy, and he made a calculation. There is also the matter of what the industry had become during the years when he was stepping back from it. The Hollywood he had built his career in was a place where individual personality and raw talent could carry a film. The films that made him legendary were character-driven, dialogue-heavy, emotionally complex works that placed enormous demands on the actor at the center and rewarded those demands with the kind of iconic scenes that people still quote and reference decades later. The industry that emerged in the 2010s was oriented around something different: franchise properties, visual effects spectacles, interconnected cinematic universes where individual performances were often secondary to the overall architecture of a series. There was still room for the kind of work he had done, but it required more searching to find it, and the energy required to do that searching was exactly the energy he had said was fading. He gave one final public gesture that revealed more about his character than almost anything in his public record. When the wildfires swept through parts of Los Angeles in early 2025, Angelica Huston lost her home. Nicholson, the man who had ended their 17-year relationship in the most painful possible way, quietly offered her his house on Mulholland Drive. The gesture was private. Neither of them made it into a story. It simply happened, and word of it reached the public indirectly. It suggested that whatever distance he had placed between himself and the world, whatever gates he had closed, the connections that had genuinely mattered to him were still intact. The man behind the gates was still paying attention, still capable of the kind of generosity that doesn't seek recognition for being generous. Jack Nicholson's disappearance from Hollywood is not a tragedy. That framing misunderstands what actually happened. A tragedy would be a man who wanted to work and couldn't. A tragedy would be someone desperate to return to the world and unable to find a way back. What actually happened is something rarer and more deliberate. A man who had given everything he had to his craft, who had received every recognition his industry offers, who had lived with a fullness and intensity that most people can barely imagine, reached a point where he had said what he came to say. And he stopped. He did not explain himself because he did not feel the need to. He did not make a farewell film because the work he had already done speaks for itself more powerfully than any farewell could. He chose the closed gate over the extended curtain call, the silence over the diminishing return, the memory over the update. In a culture that treats visibility as a form of currency and retirement as a kind of failure, that choice is actually radical. It says that the person matters more than the persona, that the life behind